Well, we're here in Seoul to talk about the COVID-19 coronavirus with Peter Pae, the Bureau Chief for Bloomberg in Seoul, and Andrew Salmon, the Northeast Asia Bureau Chief for Asia Times. Let me start with you, Andy. I think you're doing, and this will be interesting to bounce this around because we have a wire service primarily focused on business and the economics, and then you're doing sort of daily stories of a quite a broad nature.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could give us a broad brush, so bring us up to date. From when the virus first appeared in Korea to where we are now.
Sure. Well, the virus appeared in Korea very early, and no one took a great deal of notice. All eyes were on China, which was where it was, galloping ahead. Korea started to panic, of course, when we had the Shincheonji church mass infection, which was down in Daegu, and that was and remains sort of the epicenter of the virus down in Korea. So that's when I started getting busy. I had dinner here in Seoul the night after that was announced, and went down to Daegu with two friends, two colleagues the next day. And we were the first foreign reporters to hit Daegu, so we got great access. Daegu Medical Center, the Shincheonji Church, government officials spoke to us. So that was a very, very good reporting trip. And that was when Korea was in absolute panic mode. Suddenly we've got this boom, this exponential increase, which we hadn't expected because it had been sort of fairly under control. But I was very impressed by the nursing staff in Daegu Medical Center. We said, are you in a panic about this, as so much of the world suddenly seems to be? And she said, well, no, look, we've done MERS, we've done SARS, we're a specialist hospital. When we were down there, they were literally shifting the non-COVID patients out to become a dedicated COVID-19 treatment center.
And when was that? That was a month ago?
About a month ago, yeah. I have to actually look at the dates.
End February.
Yeah.
And
this is when we were getting double numbers on a daily basis.
The first thought that comes to mind, given what's happening around the world now, is that I can sort of imagine you in this medical center with the white gear on and being...
We just went in with masks.
Yeah, I was going to say that at that point...
Not anymore. You won't be able to do that. Yeah.
When you got back to Seoul, did you get tested, or did that not occur at the time?
It did occur. So, if I recall, it was a Friday. We came back, and I thought, I'll go to the gym on the Friday night. And I went in, I thought, I better wear a mask in here just in case. And then the following day, I think on the Saturday, a lot of reporters had gone down to Daegu for obvious reasons. And the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club sent around a guidance from the government saying, would all reporters who've been reporting from Daegu restrict their movements. So I went into semi-lockdown for 2 weeks. So those of you in New York, I know what it's like.
Right.
I'd occasionally go out to get a sandwich or a coffee, but I was working from home. And for me, that was very trying.
Yeah. And Peter, let me ask you this one. Sort of coming up to now, Korea appears to have, and this is the new expression, maybe it's been around before, but it's new to me, flattened the curve. Can you just sort of say how the country has achieved, how have we achieved that?
Well, again, flattening the curve is a bit of a misnomer. I mean, I think that's just a general conception that they've slowed the spread of the virus. It's not that it's not stopped, right? So flattening, it's not quite there yet, but they have slowed it significantly from the initial outbreak with the Shincheonji case church. What is getting a lot of global attention is the fact that they have been able to quickly respond, do these massive tests, reduce the mortality rate to a rate that no other country has really been able to post. For instance, a good comparison has been with the U.S. Coincidentally, the U.S. had their first case on January 19th. Korea had it on January 20th. 2 weeks later, Korea had tested almost 10,000 people, even before the Shincheonji case came along. The U.S. had only tested 220.
Wow.
Okay, the impact of that is showing up right now, and what I mean by that is whereas the last few weeks Korea's curve has kind of flattened, the U.S. numbers are just going up exponentially. Exactly the way Korea experienced, a month ago with the Shinchangi case. So the way Korea has approached it, and much of that has been lessons learned from MERS, as Daegu Hospital has told you.
MERS was, remind me again, MERS was
Middle East, yeah, it was
when
It's
was,
respiratory syndrome.
which was
2015.
2015,
Yeah.
and then SARS was sort of
Prior to
15
that.
years earlier. Right?
Yeah, about 10 years earlier. Well, Korea has gone through a viral outbreak almost every 5 or 6 years, right? And MERS being the most recent one. And that's where Korea basically, messed up. And because of the way they, basically bungled messed up on the combating the MERS outbreak, they learned a lot. In fact, there are several things that they did this time that they didn't do at MERS, which is being lauded by the world.
What did they do? What is the...
Well, one of the things that they did in MERS, which they got a lot of flack for, particularly the health ministry, was that, and this is what other countries are doing right now, or did, was that they weren't sharing the information they were getting. That was the first big mistake. And the public government officials' excuse was that they didn't want to create anxiety, right? But it was the opposite effect. Because they were withholding information, it was creating more anxiety. That's one of the big lessons they learned. And as a result of that, that's why you're seeing the Korean CDC being incredibly transparent, perhaps more than any other country, in terms of giving data on almost every possible detail. Right?
So this is when a patient is found, they interview them, find out where they've been, and then put that information out in public, and then let us decide if we want to go to that restaurant they went to, that sort of thing.
Right, and you probably get those messages on the
Right.
phone. The alerts saying, in this area there was a case, blah blah blah. Well, that information dissemination obviously was one of the key elements. Despite there was some scuttlebutts initially about the privacy issue,
Right.
because what CDC has been able to do is trace the person infected, trace their whereabouts, right? To get in touch with those that they may have been in contact with. But to do that, they've gotten credit card transaction history. They've looked at CCTV cameras, which is ubiquitous here.
Let me ask you about that. I mean, on the privacy thing, is that something that, say, in Europe and other countries couldn't be done? Or is there an intrusive part of that? I mean, what if somebody has been having an affair or something and is afraid they got infected?
That has come up here a couple of times because people
do they have
have
no
traced
right
to love motels, which is a bit
I see.
embarrassing. So that has come up. But
Right.
I mean, I'm astonished that Western societies, democracies, alleged democracies, are following the Chinese route in combating this virus. We're having mass lockdowns, citywide, province-wide, nationwide, when the most basic of human freedoms, freedom of movement, is entirely restricted. As far
Which
as I'm
hasn't happened here.
which hasn't happened here. So
Even
the Koreans
in
have
Daegu.
handled this in a very open and democratic fashion. Daegu, the bullet trains have been running through Daegu the whole time. There are no checkpoints at the city. You can go anywhere. It's been handled in a much more, I think, grown-up and democratic manner. So I find it very odd that people in America or Europe might scream and yell, my privacy has been invaded because they've contact traced where I've been for the last 2 weeks, but I'm happy to be locked up in my house for an indefinite period.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I get a lot of calls, obviously, from other bureaus in the world, and they're always amazed that, and they always assume that South Korea has locked down Daegu, right, or put some restrictions on that. And I always have to explain, no, that's not correct. There's absolutely no restrictions on Daegu. Until now, there has actually been no restrictions on any travel for people coming into Korea, unlike any other country where they've, placing severe restrictions on travel into those countries, right? even today, I mean, there is really no restriction for like the U.S. Residents to travel to Korea, but they will now be tested
Right.
immediately, which makes abundance of sense. But not a lot of countries are not doing that. You're just stopping. They're just banning folks from entering the country.
Yeah, one very, very smart thing that was done here,
Yeah.
of course, was that when you come into the country, you are mandatorily required to download an app, which allows the government to monitor you. So you've got to report in for the next 14 days. How are you feeling? I'm okay. What's your temperature? I'm okay. And of course, that goes through AI, so that becomes part of the overall monitoring system. So again, if someone who came into the country, and what we're now seeing, of course, is imported cases as Korea's return from Europe and from the US, is that, again, this adds to this excellent data spread that the South Koreans have put together, which I think is going to be extraordinarily valuable to the world, because it's probably the most comprehensive per capita data spread anyway.
I remember when this began, and it seems so long ago now, but it's just a matter of a few weeks, but the government was coming under a lot of criticism for not following the advice, I think, from the Medical Association to cut off travel with China. You were talking about travel still open with the world, basically.
They did quarantine travellers coming from
Hubei, yes.
But that was it. And Japan, of course, but that was for different reasons.
I mean, were there missteps at the beginning? Or was the government slow to respond?
Not really. I mean, of course there will be, this is Korea, politics is engaged in every area of life. So if you're right-wing, you will criticise for not banning Chinese travellers. But that having been said, as we know, the main case, the big explosion here, the Shincheonji Church, was not a Chinese problem. So I think there's a little bit of politics being played here, but on the whole, I think it's been dealt with very well. I think Peter nailed down the main issues, that the mass testing, the use of technology. But I would add a couple of other things. Yes, there was the prior experience from SARS and MERS, but purely by luck, and I'm told by government officials this was luck, not judgment. In December, the Korean CDC did a tabletop exercise for all their entire organization about a potential outbreak of a coronavirus. So they were absolutely ready. They were very, very lucky. I would add also that the main outbreak here, the Shincheonji, had this Christian religious sect, had a habit of recruiting young people. So most of the affected people were actually quite young. And of course, that's the low risk percentile. So in that sense, Korea was actually rather lucky, if you could call that, call that luck. But the other thing, which is very, very noticeable watching TV from around the world, is every man and his dog here wears a mask. And I was originally against this because a mask doesn't protect you. It protects you from your spittle flying onto others, right? But I've changed my opinion on this now. I think very, very clearly the one common denominator among Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, and they've all used very different strategies. Japan's strategy to counter this has been almost the opposite of Korea's, but has still been quite successful. So I suspect that one of the key factors uniting these three Northeast Asian democracies, which have very successfully handled this thus far, is this heavy use of masks and the fact that social distancing has very largely been enacted. And when I say social distancing, I mean just personal behaviour, not lockdown.
But can you explain that a bit more? I see a lot of people walking out in the street, often when there's no one around, wearing a mask. I see people driving a car. They're the only person in the car and they have a mask on. Is that sort of a habit, or is that preventative in some way?
I mean, there's different studies on how long this stuff can live on a surface. So I think if you're being extremely prudent and societally minded, you might want to wear a mask, 24/7.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also societal norms. It seemed to me when I first got here 4 years ago, I was wondering why people were wearing masks, and there was nothing wrong with the air, there was not pollution and stuff like that, mainly because they were sick and they did not want to spread their germs. So unlike in the US where people wearing masks to protect themselves from somebody else, there's a very social consciousness about protecting others around you. And you see that in Japan, you see that here, that people are wearing the masks to protect others so that they don't spread it. And they're fully aware of all these reports about how mask is not effective in terms of preventing infection. Right? They're wearing it so they don't spread it if they have it.
Just on that matter, I know of Koreans who've been in the US and Canada who've been abused in the street for wearing masks. So there's almost this opposite belief among some demographics.
Abused because it's assumed that they're infected.
Oh, you're Asian, maybe you're wearing it because you're infected.
Okay. Andy, I wonder if you mentioned a couple of times the Shincheonji Church, and it was this case, this cluster, if you like, which sent the numbers soaring in Korea. Can you say a little bit about this church and what was it about it? Why were there so many cases there? And maybe secondly, had this happened in, say, the Roman Catholic Church during Mass or something, it might have been a different reaction. But there was a lot of anger. The mayor of Seoul even said he was going to file suit against them for murder or something. There was a very emotional, sort of anti-cult kind of outburst. I wonder if you could talk to that a little bit.
Sure. I would add also that arguably, their HQ is down in Daegu, which is the most right-wing city in Korea, and we now have a very left-wing government. But yeah, the church, I should add, I haven't spoken to the church. They used to contact me all the time before this hit with stories that I had no interest in. Now they've got an actual story, let me talk to you guys. Complete silence, but that's the lot of the reporter. I think you're right. In a sense, they were unlucky. They were victims, and they were doing what Christians do. They were kneeling together, praying, singing hymns, yelling. So the spittle is flying. But to their discredit, of course, the Roman Catholic Church, Myeongdong Cathedral, just down the road from us here, did actually halt all services, if I recall correctly, before the Shincheonji outbreak. So some religious organizations had been far more responsible. That having been said, yeah, you're right. There's been an enormous amount of animosity aimed at this church, including from political figures like Mayor Park Won-sun, who, interestingly, is the mayor of Seoul, not the mayor of Daegu. But it seems to be ameliorating now in the sense that a couple of other churches have also had outbreaks. There's been a Zumba class, which had a big outbreak. There was the call center here in Seoul, which had a big outbreak. So I think people are starting to get used to this idea that, these outbreaks are going to happen as an act of God, could one say. And, we just have to treat them as victims. So I think that very, very strong animosity that this is a cult, it's a church, or they're even doing it on purpose, I don't know your sense, Peter, but to me it seems to be dying down, which I think is
good. And I, if I may add, the controversy with the church was there before. Has been there for decades, mainly because they have a very charismatic leader who has made pronouncements that clearly has gotten a lot of, so-called core Christians like Catholics or Protestants pretty upset at him because he is going about as like a cult leader. One of them, of course, is that he is the second coming of Jesus, etc. So those things have really.
Well, that would explain the animosity there.
Exactly. And also there's they have about 200,000 members, and a lot of them are young, single, and part of their philosophy is that they should disengage themselves from their family and their friends, that they should be devoted to the church. And that has obviously caused quite an amount of animosity, particularly from the families. There are many families, there are even groups that go in and actually kidnap the members to deprogram them, so to speak. Very much like we had the issues with the cults in the US. So that's been there way before this occurred. This, of course, added, intensified that animosity. And of course, that also added to a lot of fake news about them. So,
has there been, or do you anticipate there will be a backlash, or as you said, because there have been other clusters since? Has the whole animosity kind of died down a bit, or do you think we haven't heard the end of
One
this?
thing that's been made very, very clear by very senior government officials, including in a press conference to us, the foreign reporters, was that contrary to early reports, the church had actually cooperated extensively with the government, given over a list of members, and those members, again, went straight into the testing machine and were processed quite effectively. So this idea that they'd somehow done this on purpose, or that they were secretly hiding members and so on, appears to have been very overwrought. And I think that coverage has passed.
Yeah,
Okay.
and we have to note that they did actually cooperate even more in the sense of providing the names of every member of the church, which was an incredible breakthrough for the CDC investigators. Because if they did not have that list, obviously they would not be able to contain or slow this virus as much as they have done so now, because it would have entailed significant amount of legwork, and you would have seen probably an exponential growth beyond what was already been reported.
Right. Okay.
So in that sense, yes, the church has been cooperative.
One other subject I'd like to ask you, well, both about, whichever one of you wants to jump at it, is you mentioned, Andy, the initial panic. I think there was kind of alarm. But when I read reports about what's going on in sort of North America, Australia, Europe, and have calls from people, to me, there's a kind of, it's almost like this Hollywood movie has become reality. There's a real panic, and it seems to me that feeding that is this hoarding. The empty, the toilet paper's all disappeared. Or the
Which is
empty
another
shelf.
thing I can't figure out why, but anyhow.
And why toilet paper? It's
Have you heard the rumours? Fort Knox is shifting out of gold into pallets of toilet paper.
It's probably more valuable now.
Why hasn't that happened here?
I mean, that's a good question, to be honest. And let me admit my own long-term prejudice. I've always seen Koreans, both positively and negatively, as being this very emotive, passionate sort of people who jump and yell and scream and make a lot of noise. And my idea has been completely reversed in this crisis. The Koreans have stayed cool and calm and carried on. It's the Western Europeans, the Americans, are screaming, panicking, yelling, and say, hoarding the toilet roll.
Yeah.
So the Koreans, I think, as a nation, have behaved extremely well. So it's not just the government, which I think has provided a gold standard for the rest of the world to follow. The Korean people have reacted very, very well. And it's telling to me that if you go out to the streets today, there are still people around. They're wearing masks, they're still out, they're still engaging, they're still working, they're still socializing to an extent, and most importantly, they're still consuming. And I think that's going to help this economy, which is already, I guess we'll talk in a minute, is in a very, very bad shape from this. But it's going to come out in slightly better shape than European economies, which are completely closing down. And the impact that's going to have on mom and pops and SMEs, as well as the big businesses, is going to be Armageddon. Here, at least, there's some tick over of the basic economy. I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so it's hard for me to tell, but just to give you a couple of snippets, which is what I noticed that was really telling about the society here, is the other day I'm walking on the street, and people are walking around, but when they're standing at the crosswalk, they are 3 feet apart. Before they were all kind of close together, but they're following orders. They're following the prescribed government, recommendation for social distancing, and you see that everywhere now. And you see the whole mechanism of all the businesses, checking your temperature, the sanitizers everywhere. There is a collective sense that this is a national crisis, and that we're all in it together, right? And that we need to listen to the experts on this, right? I don't think you're getting that anywhere else outside of Asia. Again, there's a significant distrust of authority figures, I think particularly in the US, right? They don't trust anybody. So another telling sign is the other day, I see that there's tens of thousands of people milling around the cherry blossom in Washington, D.C. The day before, the president was telling everybody that they should not be in groups like that,
Right.
that they should engage in social distancing. Completely different reaction.
Yeah, sort of picking up on that, I think another factor is e-commerce. Korean infrastructure, companies like Coupang, Market Curly, and others, home delivery, you order by 11 o'clock at night, it's on your doorstep by 6 in the morning. Surely that's a factor, because I don't think that's so well developed in other countries.
I mean, on-demand services here, I mean, many of the unicorns in this country are engaged in that business, so it's huge, you're right. And of course, the penetration rate of smartphones, which we discussed earlier, it has been critical to the authorities' handling and monitoring of the overall situation. And people have pointed out to me, in Europe, you wouldn't be able to do that quite as effectively because people aren't quite as wireless as they are here in South Korea and East Asia as a whole. So, yeah, I mean, arguably, if you're looking down the line, what are some of the winners which will come out of this? It'll be, I think, the e-commerce and the on-demand services.
Let me shift tack a little bit, and let me ask you about sort of the unpleasant side of these type of events that comes out. I remember, again, it seems ages ago, but it's not that long ago, a few weeks ago, reading reports from Koreans and other Asians in Europe and America being subjected to abuse. The assumption being everybody's Chinese, and if somebody said, well, I'm Korean, they said, well, you're all infected anyway. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. Has that happened here? Have we had, presumably there's no reason to be attacking Western people, but were the Chinese here a bit hunkered down at the beginning? Has that been a problem?
Early on there were, and we saw that with the Blue House, the presidential website petition. I mean, there were initially nearly 1 million people who signed a petition to ban Chinese from entering Korea. And then after that wasn't, the president refused to do that, they had another petition, right, to impeach the president because he would not follow, the public's will.
But wouldn't you call? But isn't that what countries are doing? Stopping travelers from infected places? Would that constitute a sort of a discriminatory impulse?
Has been argued, but again, look at the results. Korea has contained this. Look at the numbers, much better than Western Europe and the States.
Right. So that whole movement that initially started is really died down considerably. Once the realization was that most of the outbreak here, or vast majority of the outbreak, is localized. Yes, the first 3 or 4 cases were those Koreans who traveled to China and were infected and brought it back to Korea. Once that realization set in, the whole concept of banning the Chinese, and there were even actually restaurants who put up signs early on saying no Chinese allowed, right? But the problem there was, of course, the government took a more rational approach. It's not Chinese or China. It's really specifically to those folks in Hubei province, right, and specifically to Wuhan. And they did actually restrict the travelers from there, right? They had to go on a 14-day quarantine. Much more rational approach. And now I think there's a realization that was the correct way to go about this.
Okay. Finally, let me, and importantly, let me ask you about the economics. Presumably, if the virus is the earthquake, then the economic impact is the tsunami that follows. Although there is fear of a second wave of the virus, but let's put that aside for a moment.
How are we doing, of course, that if there is a second wave of the virus, again, Japan and Korea will be much better equipped to handle it because they haven't done lockdowns. So you're not unlikely to get this, we lock down, we control it, then it bursts up again. So my understanding is you won't get this V-shaped turn if there is a second wave here, because it'll be a steady growth rather than something radical, which when Italy comes out of lockdown, who knows? But of course, that's why everyone's watching Wuhan in April the 8th. I think they're coming out of total lockdown. So.
Okay, but how about the economic impact, and what is the government doing to sort of preempt that, or either deal with what's happening now or preempt something worse?
I mean, the government's kind of throwing everything but the kitchen sink at it. I mean, to their credit. So, I mean, there's a lot of foresight. Tell me what I'm missing. We've got a 100 trillion won stabilization package for businesses. Last week, that was 50 trillion won. It was double.
100 trillion won is $100 billion?
80, 90 billion, depending on the currency
exchange rate. And exchange rates are doing this at the moment. So that's huge, and that came out of the presidential emergency funds. There's an 11 trillion won supplementary budget passed by the National Assembly last week. A bond market stabilization fund has been announced. An equity market stabilization fund has been announced. There's a currency swap arrangement with the US Federal Reserve, so there'll be dollar liquidity for businesses. And Gyeonggi Province, I think, possibly with an eye on the election in April, have just said they're going to give every citizen, regardless of age, regardless of income, 100,000 won next month as disaster basic income. And as I said, I'm sure it's entirely coincidental that there are National Assembly elections next month.
Yeah, I think these measures are unprecedented, of course, because we've never seen anything like this. Perhaps it's worse than the Asian financial crisis in 1997 or the global financial crisis of 2007. Some equate this to even probably the worst since the Great Depression, right? So that's why they're having to throw in the whole kitchen sink, because obviously Korea is unlike many of the countries in Asia, is export dominated. So what happens globally has a tremendous impact to Korea. And what's interesting to me about all this is that Korea itself is not economically as bad as some other countries. But what the fear is that global impact, hitting the Korean economy. And yes, while we saw the market crash 30%, what they're doing right now is really to stem the potential impact of the global economic collapse, which could happen and is happening in some ways.
I've got to say, I mean, this is unique in my lifetime. Yeah. I go through wars, terrorism, financial disasters, earthquakes, and so forth, but nothing like this. I mean, even in Berlin in 1945, commercial activity was underway. People still went shopping, even went to restaurants and bars. But across much of Europe and much of the States now, everything's closed down. So what damage this is going to have, I mean, as I said, I think it's unprecedented in our lifetimes.
I think there's only one time, and that was only for one day, and that was after 9/11, or the day of 9/11. We saw that in the U.S., where everything just shut down. But that was just a day.
A day.
This is, we don't know how long this is going to last.
Or in in some cases.
All right, well, good luck with your reporting on this. And thanks very much for coming out today to talk to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fun.